Good afternoon, and welcome to our August webinar, a collaborative presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment Training and Support Center. My name is Jamie Greco, and I am the Training and Support Specialist at RTSC. Our technical producers today are Renee Williams and Danny Harden. Today's webinar is Unaccompanied Homeless Youth, Surrogate Parents and School Enrollment, presented by Patricia Julianelle, the Director of State Projects and Legal Affairs for the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth. She also works as an independent legal consultant for state and local governments and nonprofit organizations such as the National Disability Rights Network, the University of Texas, and the California Research Bureau. Patricia has conducted workshops on the rights of children and youth at conferences across the nation, and her writing has been published in many academic journals. Patricia's commitment to advocating for youth education arises from her experiences assisting juvenile public defenders, representing disadvantaged families as a special education attorney, and experiencing urban education firsthand as an assistant high school teacher in Washington, D.C. and Portland, Oregon. During the webinar, please type your questions in the toolbox and feel free to engage with other attendees. If you are interested in learning more about the Federation, please go to our website at www.fcsn.org and explore all the different programs, including how to volunteer to become a special education surrogate parent or attend one of the trainings presented by the Parent Training Information Center. Welcome, Patricia. We're so glad you could have joined us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Janie, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank all of the participants for taking time out of your day today to attend this webinar on what to me is a very important subject, unaccompanied homeless youth with disabilities, and how we can work together to ensure they have school enrollment and receive the services to which they are entitled. And I would like to also give a shout out to Nancy Reeder, who works with the National Association for State Directors of Special Education and who has been an important collaborator on our work together around homelessness and children with disabilities. I want to provide a little bit of background information, and then I will provide some legal information about some of the laws that pertain specifically to youth who are homeless on their own and also have disabilities. So a little bit of background, some of the causes of homelessness, and if you're not familiar with children and youth experiencing homelessness, some of this may come as a surprise to you. A lot of people don't really even realize that there are homeless youth in their communities because youth experiencing homelessness tend to be invisible. They tend to hide. They don't really want necessarily to have contact with any systems like child welfare or juvenile justice. And they don't really want people to know what's going on in their family lives or in their personal lives. So a lot of this is hidden. But in terms of the causes of homelessness, lack of affordable housing combined with poverty is kind of the basic combination that lead most families into homelessness, particularly post-recession. As we're seeing the economy recover, what we're noting is that the increase in employment availability that we're seeing is primarily at the lower end and at the middle, at the higher end of the wage spectrum. So more minimum wage jobs are available, and then more jobs for people with higher education. But for folks in the middle who are middle income, perhaps only have a high school diploma or maybe only an associate's degree, a lot of jobs have not come back. And so while we're seeing the economy recover, unfortunately we're seeing homelessness continue to increase around the country. That problem basically with just the income not meeting what people need to meet their basic needs, that combines with other issues like health problems, domestic violence, sometimes natural and other disasters also contribute to that. And then when we're talking about unaccompanied youth, there is a very important contributing factor related to family dysfunction, abuse, and neglect. How many students experiencing homelessness? We actually do have data on this. Every public school in the country is required to identify the students experiencing homelessness in that school, and the school districts report that data to the states, which in turn report that data to the federal government. So from the U.S. Department of Education, we have the figure that over 1.3 million students were identified as experiencing homelessness in the 2013-14 school year. And in just a minute, we're going to get into the McKinney-Vento Act, and you'll see why it says McKinney-Vento students there. But you can see that it's really a giant number of students. And that 13-14 data represents a 7% increase nationally over the prior year, a 100% increase since the year right before the recession back in 2007. And it really is a significant proportion of the students that are being served in school districts around the country, particularly school districts with high rates of poverty. Now, the impacts of homelessness on children and youth are things that you probably would expect. Obviously, they're very significant and they're very negative. We know that students experiencing homelessness have higher incidences of illnesses, both acute and chronic illnesses, higher incidences of depression, anxiety, which you can imagine if you are a child and you don't know where you're going to sleep tonight or where your next meal is going to come from. Obviously, that's going to provoke depression and anxiety. We know that early childhood experiences of homelessness have significant effects not only for that infant or toddler, but also looking into elementary education and even into high school education. So early childhood homelessness is associated with poor classroom engagement and poor social skills in elementary school, and those achievement gaps tend to persist and even worsen over time, such that by the time we get to high school, a youth who experiences homelessness in high school is 87% more likely to drop out of school, and that's the highest correlating factor that was found in that particular study. So we know that homelessness is having a significant impact on students' ability to succeed and to graduate from school. And that gets us really to what I want to focus on today, which is what are schools doing and what can schools do? Teachers, school administrators, special education teams, surrogate parents, etc., to help minimize those negative effects on homelessness on students, and particularly those with disabilities. So the first thing we want to talk about is the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. That is a federal law that was originally passed back in 1987, and it's gone through various iterations since then. And most recently, as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, it was reauthorized and amended again back in December of the last year. The amendments to the Every Student Succeeds Act are going into effect in just a couple of months, October 1st, 2016. So these are all issues that schools will be dealing with in this upcoming academic year. Now, the McKinney-Vento Act is not part of Title I. If you're familiar with the Title I program, that's the largest federal education program for economically disadvantaged students. And while the McKinney-Vento Act is not part of Title I, it works very, very closely with Title I, as you might imagine, since we know that between poverty and homelessness, obviously there needs to be a close relationship between Title I and McKinney-Vento. And just to give you a 30,000-foot look at how McKinney-Vento works, of course, it is a federal law, and as most federal laws, the way it works is that it appropriates some federal money to states. It's an $85 million, that's the national amount of money that goes out to states under McKinney-Vento, and then the states go ahead and keep some of that at the state level for their administration, and then they award the rest of that money to school districts and or charter schools in the state. So again, depending on what state you're in, the number of school districts in your state that get McKinney-Vento funds will vary. It's definitely not every school district in the state. It may be somewhere between 5 and 10%. However, every school district does need to implement the McKinney-Vento Act, does need to comply with it. So I spoke a little bit earlier about students experiencing homelessness, and I called them McKinney-Vento students. And that's because the McKinney-Vento Act has a very specific definition of homelessness. And it's important to know what that means because it's probably not what you might automatically think of when you think of a homeless person. So as you can see, the definition of homeless includes children who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And the largest and really most important category for schools is the first one, which is children and youth who are sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. Sometimes people use a shorthand to refer to that, and they call those students doubled up. There are families, for example, who become evicted, or their house burns down, or because of domestic violence or abuse in the home, they need to flee their home, and they don't have the economic means to have another place to go. So they end up staying with a neighbor or a friend from church or a relative and those accommodations are temporary, and they're often very inadequate. It may be sleeping on a couch, it may be sleeping in a garage, it may be a fifth wheel in someone's backyard. And unaccompanied youth in particular often end up going couch to couch. So someone's parent might let them stay for a few nights, then they might go to an aunt, then they might end up in a garage, then they might go back to some other friend. So there's a lot of movement happening. As you can see, that's 3/4 of the McKinney-Vento students that schools serve. So the largest population of homeless students are living in that situation. And that's really because in many communities there is nowhere else for homeless children and families to go. There is no shelter. If there is a shelter, the shelter is full. Especially with climactic issues, it's really not a good idea for children and youth to sleep outside. It's not a good idea for anyone to sleep outside, but you can imagine a baby, a toddler, even an unaccompanied youth sleeping in an unsafe situation outside. So people often will just kind of crash wherever they can. Other elements of the definition of homeless start to get a little bit more of what we think of when we think of homelessness. So there are youth and families who stay in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or campgrounds due to the lack of an adequate alternative. So again, many trailer parks are absolutely adequate. They're stable, they're fixed housing. Those families would not be considered homeless. But there also are dilapidated trailers with extension cords running across the yard and broken out windows and holes in the floor, and those clearly are not adequate accommodations. Additional elements of the definition, children and youth living in emergency or transitional shelters. That's pretty obvious, of course, but you'll see that that's only 15% of the students that schools are serving. And then children and youth who are living in public places, living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, etc. And any children who might be migratory children in that they are farm workers or agricultural workers or fishers, they also would be considered to be homeless if they're living in those situations. So unaccompanied homeless youth, which is really our focus today, those are youth who are living in those homeless situations that we just went over, but they're not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So they're just separated from their legal parents, and there's a variety of reasons why that might happen. Some homeless youth become separated from their parents just because of the realities of homelessness. Somebody might have a couch for one child and a parent, but they don't have a couch for the other children. Someone might be willing to accept younger children, but they really don't want a 17-year-old young man or woman in their home with them. Many shelters don't accept adolescent boys, for example. So sometimes there's just separation that happens because of homelessness. However, what we see more often is separation that happens because of issues that are going on in the family, abuse, neglect, and dysfunction. So when we look at data around runaway and homeless youth, we can see that many are fleeing abuse. 20 to 50% report sexual abuse, 40 to 60% report physical abuse. Many young people are leaving their homes because of illegal and unsafe activity happening in the home. So for example, drugs are being prepared or sold in the home. Prostitution is happening in the home. There may be substance abuse or alcohol abuse in the home that often leads to violence. So we know a lot of children are leaving their homes even as young as 12, 13 years old because of those issues happening at home. We also know that there is a disproportionate number of youth who identify as LGBTQ among the homeless youth population. They may be being forced out of their homes by parents who don't approve of their sexual orientation or gender identity, or they may just feel like they have to leave that environment. And there's also a highly disproportionate rate of parenting and pregnant teens among the homeless youth population. Again, many being forced out of their homes by parents who are unhappy about their pregnancy, and they end up homeless and with no place else to go. Now let's move a little bit into IDEA right away, of course, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, because we want to make sure that we're addressing the needs of unaccompanied homeless youth with disabilities. And as I mentioned earlier, homelessness itself has effects that can lead to students being identified as students with a disability because of some of the emotional consequences of homelessness and a lot of the stress and trauma that they may be experiencing from a very young age up into young adulthood. So we do have a disproportionate number of homeless youth who do have disabilities. And when we're working with unaccompanied homeless youth, of course, since they're not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian, the question becomes, well, who makes decisions for these youth, particularly in terms of special education? So a couple of things to go over. Of course, those of you who have a lot of experience working with IDEA and the notion of parents, you know that the definition of parent under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is a bit broader than what we might ordinarily think of. So of course, first of all, we've got natural or adoptive parents. Our unaccompanied homeless youth do, generally speaking, have parents who are out there somewhere, but they're not particularly involved in the youth's life. And so there may be a situation where a parent simply doesn't respond to the attempts of the school district to make contact about special education services. The school district sends out notices, for example, of IEP meetings, and there's just no response. There's no answer coming. When that happens and the school district documents those attempts to try to contact the parent and that those attempts have been unsuccessful, then the school district must go on to find another way to have someone to make those decisions. They can't just sort of say, oh, well, you know, we can't find the parent, so we're kind of stuck. Of course, that's not good for the student or for the school. So that's where we get into the idea of surrogate parents. Before I get into surrogate parents, though, I do want to make sure we talk about another piece of the definition of parent under IDEA, which is individuals acting in the place of a parent. Those individuals can include a grandparent, step-parent, or other relative, but they don't actually have to be a relative. They do need to be someone with whom the child is living. And I wanted to mention that because many unaccompanied youth actually do have an individual who is acting in the place of a parent and with whom that child is living. Particularly some of our younger unaccompanied homeless youth, they may have left home, but they may have moved in with sometimes a relative, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, etc., or sometimes just a mentor. In fact, oftentimes it's actually a mentor from school. It may be a coach. It may be someone from their faith community. It may be a family friend. And that person, while not assuming any kind of legal custody over the youth, is acting in the place of a parent, is providing that youth with shelter, with a home, and with care. And those kinds of individuals do meet IDEA's definition of parent. Now that said, unfortunately, many of our unaccompanied homeless youth really are completely on their own. They may have adults who are tangentially involved in their lives and who give them a meal and who give them a little support now and then, but they certainly wouldn't rise to the level of acting in the place of a parent. And so those youth really don't have an adult who is available to make special education decisions for them, and that's where we get into surrogate parents, of course, and thank goodness that we have surrogate parents available for those young people. Now, each public agency must ensure that the rights, specifically the rights of unaccompanied homeless youth, are protected. That's in the regulations to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act as well as the statute itself. And part of making sure that the rights of unaccompanied homeless youth are protected is making sure that those youth have surrogate parents appointed when they need them. So, of course, many of our unaccompanied homeless youth will go through the process. They will have a surrogate parent appointed to represent them. And, you know, communication, of course, between the surrogate parent and youth is very important. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that unaccompanied homeless youth very often have developed their own support networks. So, like I said, they may have that person from church, they may have a family friend, they may have a coach. And particularly for a surrogate parent who's coming into that youth's life, oftentimes with no knowledge of that youth or no history, connecting with some of those other people, of course, with the youth's agreement and assistance, can really help provide the surrogate parent with some understanding about what that youth has gone through, what some of the challenges have been, and help ensure effective communication between the parent and the youth. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that we know that because homelessness oftentimes makes youth move around a lot, they may cross district lines repeatedly. Hopefully they're staying in the same school, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they may be changing schools. And so sometimes the surrogate parent for unaccompanied homeless youth is a bit more challenging than it would be for another student with a disability. And so IDEA regulations actually take that into account, and it says that to avoid delays in evaluations or in services, we can actually have what are known as temporary surrogate parents for unaccompanied homeless youth. And this is really a unique procedure that's only available for our unaccompanied homeless youth. It's not meant to be a permanent situation. It really is temporary, as the name states. But what it says is that you may have someone from a shelter, you may have someone from an independent living program, you may even have someone from the school. As I mentioned, a lot of times our homeless youth are very strongly connected with school counselors, with teachers, with coaches. And that's someone that the youth knows, feels comfortable with, someone who is available quickly who can be assigned as a temporary surrogate to just get the ball rolling, sign for evaluations, get an IEP in place. As I said, that does not replace the regular surrogate parent process. That still has to happen, and a fully compliant surrogate parent would need to be appointed. But there can be sort of an emergency stopgap provision so that we don't have delays in these youth receiving services. And I put a little link there on the bottom of your slide where you can get some more detailed information about temporary surrogates. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the McKinney-Vento staff that can be of support to special education staff. So we may have surrogate parents, special education teachers, evaluators who are working with an unaccompanied homeless youth, and they may need some more background information. They may need to know, where did this youth come from, who can give us some history, and who can explain to us what are the students' rights under McKinney. You know, our special education team, of course, are going to be experts in IDEA, but they may not know exactly what McKinney-Vento requires or provides. So just to give you an idea of who you can call for help. Oh, do we have a question?
Yeah, I just want a little bit of a clarification here from one of our people in the audience. In Massachusetts, the special education surrogate parents are very much connected to the Department of Children and Families and that child welfare. We're wondering if, when you're speaking of the surrogate parents from the national perspective, which I know that you are looking at, they don't necessarily have to go through the child welfare system. Is that true?
Absolutely not. In fact, most unaccompanied youth are not involved in child welfare,
Okay.
and in most cases don't need to be. There may be, obviously, there are mandatory reporting requirements that will come into play, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. But
Mm-hmm.
most unaccompanied youth are not involved in the child welfare system, so they don't have child
So is
welfare
it
social workers or foster parents.
okay? So that makes sense. So the excuse me, the person who would be responsible for appointing a surrogate parent then would be the schools or
That is correct.
okay, thank you. All right, so I just want to make sure the audience understands that this is a little different than the surrogate parent program that is run through the Department of Children and Families in Massachusetts. Okay.
Thank you for clarifying that. That is a very important clarification, and it's particularly important because we know from research and even just anecdotally from the young people that we work with through our program that many youth, if they think that they may be involved in the child welfare system, they actually will not show up at school. They'll kind of hide out because they don't want that kind of systems involvement. So that is a really important separation, and I appreciate you raising that. Okay, so in terms of McKinney-Vento implementers who can help you out with understanding the rights and the issues around youth experiencing homelessness, every state must designate a state coordinator. Of course, the state of Massachusetts does have a state coordinator and an office in the Massachusetts Department of Education that works on this issue. Sarah Slaughterback is the person that I work with in the Department of Education in Massachusetts on McKinney-Vento issues. She and all the state coordinators around the country have a number of duties, and you can see them on your slide. I don't think I need to go over them all in depth, but just a couple of things to let you know what information is available to you. The website for homeless education in every state has information about the liaisons. Now, we're going to talk about liaisons in a minute, but those are school district level implementers of the McKinney-Vento Act. So if you want to know, I wonder who does McKinney-Vento in my school district, your State Department of Education website should have a list of those folks in every school district and their contact information, and that's in every state. So again, since we know that homelessness leads to a lot of mobility, it would not at all be unusual for a student in Massachusetts to have previously been in Rhode Island or New Hampshire or even Texas or California. And you can even go on those states' websites and find out who was the liaison in that student's previous school district that I can contact and try to get some information. State coordinators also do respond to inquiries from parents and from unaccompanied youth. So a student himself or herself actually can go ahead and call the office and say, I've got some questions about what school I can go to and what are some of my rights. And of course, a surrogate parent or a teacher or anyone else certainly could call the state coordinator with those questions as well. Now, those local liaisons that I mentioned, as I said, every local educational agency must designate a McKinney-Vento liaison. So every school district and your charter schools will have a liaison, and that person really is the person at the local level who understands McKinney-Vento and what are the rights of students experiencing homelessness, including students with disabilities. You can see again the various duties of the liaison. They do have many duties. One thing to be aware of is that liaison is going to be the person who's collecting information about who is experiencing homelessness in the school district. So if you happen to be working with a student and you, through your work, realize that that student's experiencing homelessness, and maybe that student really hasn't told anyone that yet because of concerns about stigma or other issues, you could talk with that student and connect him or her with the liaison, and that not only would allow the liaison to have more accurate data, but also would allow the liaison to then connect that student to all the different McKinney-Vento services that may be available. So you can help the liaison with that identification piece. And liaisons also are going to be putting out notice. Again, that may be important for you to know. Your liaison may have brochures or posters or other information about McKinney-Vento that you could ask to have copies of, and then you could use that with your own contact with students. Liaisons also are providing training, so hopefully if you haven't received training on McKinney-Vento, you will at some point soon within your own school environment. And they are connecting students to lots of different services, including early intervention services for infants and toddlers, just to let you know about that piece. So we've discussed who is considered to be eligible for McKinney-Vento services, who's homeless. We've talked about unaccompanied youth. We've talked about state coordinators and liaisons. And so what I want to do now briefly is just talk a little bit about what the laws provide. Again, we're not going to go into incredible detail on this because we don't have that much time, but we will provide you with resources for where you can go for more information later, and hopefully at least leave you with some kernels of ideas that will help you support students. I think the core of McKinney-Vento is about school stability. And I won't spend a lot of time on the research on school stability, but there has been extensive research showing that when students can stay in one school, that's good for them and it's good for the school, and particularly when we're talking about students with disabilities who may have an IEP in place, they may have services in place, they may have disabilities that really make it harder for them to transition from one school to another, one set of teachers and peers to another. So we really do want to do everything we can to keep our students stable, and particularly students who are dealing with the upheaval of homelessness. So the McKinney-Vento Act actually says that students experiencing homelessness can stay in one school. They call that the school of origin. So students can continue in the school of origin for as long as they're for as long as they are homeless. And they can also complete the academic year when they find permanent housing. We're going to talk about the definition of school of origin in just one second. But of course, the idea there is let's stay in one school, even if homelessness has us moving around across attendance lines or even across school district or even state lines. Students experiencing homelessness also have the right to enroll in the public school close to where they're living. And that particularly comes into play when homelessness might move students all the way across the state and there's really no way for them to stay in their school of origin. So the definition of school of origin you can see on this slide. That means the school the child attended when permanently housed or in which last enrolled. So just to throw out an example to try to make this a little more concrete, if I am attending school, let's say in Providence, and I lose my housing and I end up staying with an aunt who lives in Boston, I do have a school of origin. My school of origin is in Providence. I also have a local school, which is whatever school is close to where my aunt's house is, where I happen to be staying. So there's the definition piece. The question would be, is it really going to make sense for me to go back to Providence every day to go to school? And we're going to take a look at that question in a minute. School of origin also includes feeder school patterns. So for example, if an elementary school ends at 6th grade and all of the 6th graders, they all go up to the same middle school for 7th grade. It's a feeder pattern where the students, it's almost like staying in the same building, except they just move over to another building. For those feeder school patterns, if I'm moving from 6th grade to 7th grade, I'd be able to go ahead and follow that feeder. So again, I can stay with my peers and have that stability of being with my friends and my peers from my prior school. Now remember when I talked about being in Providence and then moving up to Boston, how do we decide if a student's going to stay in their school of origin or if they're going to enroll in the local school? Well, that is always based on the best interest of the student. we're always going to presume that keeping the student in the school of origin is in their best interest. Again, we know school stability is best for students, so that's what we're going to try to do, unless that's against what the parent, guardian, or youth want. And we're going to look at student-centered factors. We're going to look at the impact of mobility on achievement. We're going to look at health and safety issues. And we're going to give priority to the request of the parent or guardian, or if we're working with an unaccompanied youth, we're going to give priority to the request of the youth. So you can see as you look through this slide, the subtext, or sometimes the actual text, is really saying we want to keep students in one school as long as that's in their best interest. Now, there may be reasons why it's not in their best interest. For example, it may be a 3-hour commute each way, and there's just no way that that's in a student's best interest. There may be reasons, for example, for a student with disabilities, where they really can't be on a bus for an extended period of time. And so for them, maybe even a 1-hour commute is just too long. It's not safe, for example, for that student. There may be issues related to the student's IEP where actually the local school might have some different and maybe even better services for that particular student than the school of origin did. So there might be different reasons why it actually would be in the student's interest to change schools, and that's what the school is going to look at, case by case, student by student, making that decision. It's also important to know that transportation to the school of origin is required. So again, the right to remain in the school of origin really doesn't mean anything if the student can't get there. So there is the requirement to provide transportation to and from the school of origin at the request of the parent or guardian, and the liaison will help arrange that for unaccompanied youth. Now, this requirement overlaps with the transportation requirement under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They're sort of like the Venn diagram with 2 circles that overlap in the middle. Some students will have transportation listed as a related service on their IEP, and so if they're attending the school of origin, they will get transportation to the school of origin under their IEP. Some students won't have transportation as a related service on their IEP. In that case, they'll still get transportation to the school of origin, but that will really be a McKinney-Vento service, and the funding for how that is paid for, of course, will be different depending on whether it's a related service or not. We can't use, obviously, special education funding to provide a service that is not related to that student's needs and that student's disability. Now, as I mentioned, we won't always be able to keep students in their school of origin. There may be reasons of distance or other reasons why we can't do that. If that is the case, then as I said before, students experiencing homelessness can enroll in the school wherever they happen to be staying, whether that's at a friend's house or in a car or in a shelter or in a bus station. They can enroll in the local school, and they are entitled to immediate enrollment. That enrollment is immediate even if they don't have the documents that are normally required, even if they don't have a copy of their IEP, proof of residency, guardianship, for example, if it's an unaccompanied homeless youth. They can go ahead and have immediate enrollment in that local school, regardless of the documentation that they have available at that time. Of course, homelessness often leads to families and students not having a little folder with all of their school documents and immunizations and other documents there. So we need to get the children in school immediately and work on the documents later. I do want to point out that the terms enroll and enrollment include attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So that means we need that child in school, fully participating immediately. For students with disabilities, that means putting in place the best services that we can with the information that we have as we make the effort to track down IEPs and other documents. There's also an important requirement for states and school districts to revise their policies to remove barriers to this immediate enrollment and retention of students in school. So to the extent that there maybe is a school policy that says, oh, you know, we can't let our special education students enroll until we have a copy of the IEP, the federal law will supersede that local policy, but it's still a good idea to change the local policy just to avoid having a barrier that might create some confusion that might result in the student being out of school for a day or a few days. That, of course, would not be acceptable. Just a couple of other pieces under the McKinney-Vento Act just to make sure you're aware of, particularly if you're working with older youth. There do have to be procedures in place to make sure that students can participate fully in academic and extracurricular activities. So that would include summer school, whether that's extended school year services under an IEP or otherwise, making sure that we're eliminating barriers to those. And also barriers that prevent youth from accruing partial credits, particularly at the high school level for unaccompanied homeless youth. They may be changing high schools multiple times because of their homelessness, and if they're not able to accrue partial credits, it's very easy for them to quickly lose credit for an entire semester because they may have divided that semester over 2 or 3 different schools. And you can imagine how that could lead a youth to sort of lose hope in school and drop out as they see graduation kind of getting pushed further and further off into the distance. So it's very important for us to have practices and procedures in place that allow youth to earn partial credits here, there, and combine those so that they continue to move forward and accrue credits towards graduation. In terms of students with disabilities in particular, it's important to note that at the school district as well as at the state level, we need to make sure that McKinney-Vento and IDEA are coordinated. So again, hopefully special education professionals and liaisons know who each other are, they're in touch with each other, they're working together on particular students because they each have different pieces of the puzzle, different information and different expertise to bring to the table to fully support students. So for surrogate parents, for teachers, for special education evaluators and psychologists to be in communication with liaisons and vice versa is really important. I also wanted to point out that oftentimes when school districts are evaluating students experiencing homelessness, again, because of that mobility that homelessness causes, sometimes it can be a challenge to get those evaluations done within the time frames because students might be moving across districts in the middle of the process, and it does make it difficult. That's why the U.S. Department of Education has said that there really are compelling reasons to do the evaluations of McKinney-Vento students even faster than we normally would do for other students. If we have the student, let's try to push that process as quickly as possible and try to get it done before we might end up losing that student and they might have their process delayed over time. I'll never forget, I worked with a very young student once in Texas. She was just 5 years old, and her mother was fleeing domestic violence, and so they had moved a lot because of that domestic violence complication. And that young girl, she was a girl, 5-year-old, had autism, and she had been trying, her mom had been trying since the child was 3 years old to get her into preschool special education. And because of the mobility, she had never gotten into preschool education because she had been starting an evaluation and then moving and then starting over. By the way, evaluations are not supposed to start over in the middle, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it really just highlights the need to let's try to get this done, try to get an IEP in place and get some services going so that even if we do lose that student a week after we finish the evaluations, it's very frustrating, but at least that student's now going to a new place with an IEP done and can get some services in place quickly. Here's where we go to the evaluation piece that I just mentioned. As I mentioned, that 5-year-old, her evaluations were starting over every time she moved. That is not the way it should happen. Once parental consent for evaluations is obtained, the clock sort of starts running, and it really doesn't stop. It continues running, even if that young person changes school districts, moves to a different state even. We want to make sure that the evaluations continue, that they don't stop and start all over again. The only time that we can get an extension on that time frame under IDEA is if the new school district can show that they really are making some progress and they're working hard to complete the evaluations promptly, and the parent actually agrees to an extension of the time frame. So again, a lot of pressure to try to get those evaluations done as quickly as possible and to coordinate with the prior school to find out what has been done, what hasn't been done, and what do we need to finish up so that we can get this child some services that are appropriate. Once we actually do have an IEP for a student, that IEP, of course, can follow the student across district lines. And as we said, we do have immediate enrollment for our McKinney-Vento students. So that means getting them into school, getting them attending classes and participating fully immediately, working to get a copy of the previous IEP as quickly as possible. And the new school district must immediately provide appropriate services, which means services comparable to those described in the previous IEP. As those services are being provided, of course, that new school district can adopt the old IEP or it can develop a new one. That's going to depend on a lot of different factors related to the needs of the student, maybe even related to the time in the school year, what's available in that particular LEA. But really, the important thing to keep in mind here is that we need to make sure that highly mobile students are in school and getting appropriate services right away, and that this other paperwork and evaluations and other IEP issues that may need to come up are being done while that student is in school getting services. So those are the nitty-gritty of the legal details that we wanted to share with you in terms of those overlaps between the issue of homelessness and the issue of special education. I've got my contact information up there, and anyone is welcome to contact me at any time with questions or to follow up. I know it's been kind of a lot of detailed legal information that if you're not used to working with this population, a lot of this may have been new to you. So I'd be happy to clarify. And if there are questions that have come in during the session, I'd be happy to address any of them.
Hi, Patricia. Yes, some questions have come in, and I think people are having a little bit of a hard time um, to understand the SESPs, or what some people call them ESPs, their role with regard to the McKinney-Vento liaisons. I think one of the problems is that um, McKinney-Vento is a lot like the foster care rules that are coming out. I know this is a little bit beyond your reach at this moment in time, but the new ESSA creates a lot of new laws that are very similar to McKinney-Vento laws. We're not going to go into that right now. We're going to address that later on in another webinar. But I've had a couple of questions regarding education, surrogate parents having a conflict of interest if they are appointed from the school personnel. And I know that we at the Federation are looking at the conflict of interest idea for surrogate parents. I think nationally that is, it's traditionally been that the surrogate parents have been appointed through the schools and possibly our teachers or counselors within the school. That has not been best practice in Massachusetts, although we are looking at that through our what we call our LEA initiative, where we are encouraging schools to help us to appoint surrogate parents through the school districts. So the interface between the surrogate parent, and I'm talking about our particular program, our surrogate parent program, and the McKinney-Vento liaisons would in most cases also involve the Department of Children and Families. But I think what you're saying, Patricia, is that the Department of Children and Families or the child welfare agencies are not necessarily involved with kids that are homeless. So what I'm thinking, and I might be wrong in this, is that there are not a lot of surrogate parents being appointed for kids in Massachusetts who are homeless. And I don't know why not. They're certainly not going through our program. And I've not heard the schools speaking about that. So that, I think, is something we need to really take a look at. My supervisor is across the table from me and saying, yes, we need to really take a look at this. But have you found that that's a problem, Patricia, where it's not actually happening? The surrogate parents are not being appointed when the parents or the guardians cannot be found?
Well, I definitely don't have any information, about Massachusetts specifically. So, I absolutely have not heard of it being a problem in Massachusetts, but it's not something that I've really explored. I do think that, well, a couple of issues. Of course, there's a difference between a local education agency being involved in appointing a surrogate parent and that surrogate parent actually being an employee of the local educational agency. And so it would not be acceptable, even for McKinney-Vento students, for that surrogate parent to actually be an employee of the school system, except for the specific exception that I mentioned around temporary surrogate parents. And that is a very limited exception only for unaccompanied homeless youth, and only toward the end of ensuring that services are not delayed for a student. So there would still need to eventually and hopefully quickly be a regular surrogate parent appointed who would follow the regular process and who would not be a school employee in that case. So in terms of the interface with liaisons, I wouldn't suggest that a liaison actually be a surrogate parent. I think that would be appropriate and potentially even a violation of IDEA. But the liaison would be a person who would have information about how the McKinney-Vento Act would come into play for a particular student. And so, for example, a surrogate parent might not know that a student can stay in the school of origin. So all of a sudden, you might have a student coming into a new school, and it really would have made a lot of sense for that student to stay in their previous school. It might be the end of the school year, it might be April, and all of a sudden it's an 11th grader trying to start over in a new high school in April of the school year. If that surrogate parent had received information from the liaison, the surrogate parent might be in a situation to say, wait, whoa, stop the presses. Has anybody talked to the liaison? Has anybody asked this youth if maybe she wants to stay in her school of origin because she has the right to do that? So I just think exchanging information about what's available for students who are covered under both laws, under both McKinney-Vento and IDEA, can really help both the liaison and the surrogate parent be more effective because they'll just have better information about what the options are for that student.
Okay, so I think I'm still a little confused because the idea of a temporary special surrogate parent is a new thing for me. So temporary means emergency, and yet after the emergency, for example, the original consent to evaluate is signed, then we would go on to appoint a long-term surrogate parent. And as my supervisor has just reminded me that we deal with the LEAs, the local educational agencies, to recruit SESPs, not to appoint them. And I think that's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Then once they're recruited, they will go through our program. But again, I don't see how the process would go on for even the temporary surrogate parents, um, and for to be appointed. Who would appoint that surrogate parent? Generally, I would think it was somebody within the school district. And I do agree that the conflict of interest becomes an issue, because if you've got a paycheck coming from the school district that might be paying for services, that's going to be a problem. Um, but if the student has a potential relationship with someone at the school, you had suggested a coach or a school counselor, um, that would be okay, even though they're drawing a paycheck from the school district. So I think I'm having trouble with the conflict of interest piece, the time frame for being an emergency surrogate parent, and who exactly will be appointing those people.
And it seems like there may be a process in Massachusetts that's a bit different than in other places, where oftentimes it's the State Department of Education or the LEA who's really overseeing the appointment of surrogates. And it sounds like maybe your Department of Children and Families is doing that in Massachusetts. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
again, most of our certainly children who are homeless in general are not involved in the child welfare system, and even unaccompanied homeless youth, very few of them are involved in the child welfare system. So that would be an
I,
overlap that wouldn't happen.
Yes, and I absolutely agree with that. I'm going to ask the audience out there if there are any McKinney-Vento liaisons in the audience. If you could give us some information about the appointment of surrogate parents for kids who are not in child welfare but would need to have a temporary surrogate parent. I don't know the process in Massachusetts. I'm almost 100% certain that DCF is not involved in that process. And I know it's confusing some of our audience about that. Um, so anyway, I don't have the answers for a lot of the questions that are coming through. I apologize. But I do know that one of the things that has happened in the ESSA, Patricia, is that the new ESSA is that kids in the DCF shelters, and they're called the STAR shelters in Massachusetts, are
Yes.
no longer considered to be homeless. That's true, right?
That is correct. There is a new program under Title I Part A that covers all children in foster care.
Right. So it's interesting because the STAR program in Massachusetts was set up to have kids within a relatively short distance to their home schools or their schools of origin. And they're usually under the auspices of DCS. So that's going to change dramatically. And I believe that law goes into effect on uh,
December
December
10th.
10th, right?
Yes, and those children will still have the right to remain in the school of origin, as
Yes.
they do now. There will be some additional responsibility on Children and Family Services to fund the transportation for those students.
Yes, that's right. So that's going to be a big change, and that's something that we can talk about further down the line. I'm just going to read the questions here for a couple of seconds, Patricia, because they're getting to be very long. So just give me a couple of seconds here to read through
Sure.
them.
Sure,
And
and while you read through them, I can point people to the resources, particularly if you go to that second bullet, there is a document that is specifically about surrogate parents for unaccompanied homeless youth. It's a document that's a joint document between my organization, NACI, and the National Association of State Directors of Special Education. And so if you're confused about surrogate parents for unaccompanied homeless youth, temporary surrogate parents for unaccompanied youth, I think that document really breaks it down into just its core elements and hopefully will be very helpful to understand what the law says about that issue.
I'm sorry, I was muted there. So somebody is suggesting that we take a look at the homeless surrogate parent program, the temporary one, and figure this out. And that's definitely something that's on my checklist to do this afternoon. And let's see, the process should go through. Okay, so they're talking about how to get people to work with the homeless youth or the unaccompanied minors to go through our program, and that would make sense. Um,
Jane, I'm not sure if others are having trouble. I'm having some trouble hearing you, like your audio is cutting out. That might just be me. If it is just me, I apologize. Jane, I'm afraid I'm still not hearing you. I'm not sure if others are hearing you.
Hello?
Hi, I hear you now, Jane.
Okay, good. I think my microphone broke just there in the middle of
Uh-oh.
everything.
Oh,
So
no.
now I have a new microphone, and I apologize. I'm seeing everybody saying they can't hear me, and I didn't know that. So essentially, what I was saying was that most people are saying that
Oh, Jane, I think we may have lost you again. Jane, I think we lost you again.
um, they feel that speak a little bit more to that. That's kind of an interesting question for me.
Yes.
Um, I know the IDEA, I believe, says that the surrogate parent may not have a conflict of interest and that is one of the reasons why the child welfare people cannot be surrogate parents. Do you know a lot about um, the appointment of surrogate parents throughout the country? They are not generally uh, part of the school system, right?
Generally, a surrogate parent should not be an employee of the school system.
School
That's
system,
correct.
okay. All right, except on that very temporary basis, right?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
And
Only
do
for
we know?
unaccompanied homeless youth.
Oh, okay. So if you're homeless, you cannot have a temporary SESP?
The only population that can have a temporary surrogate parent is an unaccompanied homeless youth.
An unaccompanied homeless
Right.
youth. Okay.
Because an
Um,
accompanied homeless youth would be with their parent, and so they
exactly.
wouldn't
And they
need
would be
a
yes,
surrogate
they
parent.
would be making the choices.
Right.
Um, all right. So, but that's a large proportion of kids, I think, especially older kids that
Yes.
are homeless are unaccompanied. Um, okay. So we've got our work to do. And I think a lot of these questions will be answered. You know what I'm going to do, everybody? When I find out more about this particular program in Massachusetts, I will send out a little news bulletin so that we can all stay up to date on it because it's going to become more important with the new ESSA also coming out. Um, Patricia, if you could advance the slides for me so I could talk a little bit about the ones at the end, that would be great.
Absolutely. There we go. Is that the right one?
Yes. So this has to do with the new ESSA that's going into effect on December 10th. The U.S. Department of Education is presenting a series of webinars, and it's going to for kids that are in the foster care system. Um, Not necessarily kids that are homeless, but if they are in the foster care system, the rules are changing. So these four webinars are going to address those issues, the points of contact for DCF or children, child welfare and schools, how to decide where the students will be enrolled, what is the best interest determination, transportation, who's going to pay, and how far away is in the best interest, and how to resolve disputes. So these are very informative webinars. We will be listening ourselves here at the Federation. You can sign up for them about a week in advance, but keep checking this particular link that I have here to see when they're going to be presented. The one on August 17th, I think, is already full. But they will be archived on the Department of Ed's U.S. Department of Ed site. And so if you could go to the next one, Patricia, that would be great. So this is about our conference on November 15th, and we will be opening registration in September. September 15th, we're hoping for, so we're going to, if you can be watching out for that, we're going to be sending the invitations out to everyone. And I think there's one more, Patricia. I think it's just our please fill out our survey. There you go, and thank you for attending. Um, Let's see. One last question, Patricia, because I think it's addressing the shelters that are in Massachusetts. They're saying when an unaccompanied minor is living in a group home per DCF, are they considered to be homeless? Actually, if they're in a group home run by DCF, they're considered to be under the auspices and in the custody of DCF.
That's
If
correct.
you're talking about a kids group home, and a homeless shelter, not necessarily. And I think that's the difference that we need to make for these kids. Um, and I think one of the pertinent points that you made, Patricia, was that a lot of these kids don't want to be involved in DCF or child welfare, and they will go to great extents to stay out of the custody of DCF. So we've got a few things in play here. Um, any other questions? We have just actually we're out of time. So, Patricia, do you have any other last comments to make?
No, I just want to thank everyone again for your time, and again recommend that brief on surrogate parents for unaccompanied homeless youth that's on our website. I think that might help address some of the confusion.
Okay, that's great, Patricia. And I thank everyone for attending. And Patricia, thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Janie, and thanks everyone.
All right, bye bye now.
Bye.